Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and that we learn from each other today on country. This extraordinary collection of the State Library of New South Wales sits on the lands of one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition. I am coming to you from Gadigal. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are here with us today. Welcome. And welcome to everybody. It's hard to believe that it is June and we are actually halfway through our 2024 season of Scholar Talks. My name is Rachel Franks and I manage the fellows and scholars here at the library, and it really is terrific to have your company today. And I want to do a special shout out for people who have been sending in their feedback. It's so great to always hear your thoughts and views on what the fellows and scholars are doing here at the library and some of the public programming that comes out of their research. So if you've written in recently, thanks very much. It means a lot to the team here. And if you would like to know more about the program, especially as it turns 50 this year, then you can catch up with this. There's a fabulous story in the latest issue of the library's Open Book magazine. And I went around and I interviewed quite a few of our fellows and scholars from the last 50 years. So if you are a subscriber, you will see that. Or if you're a friend of the library, you should also have your copy of Open Book now. So today it's all about the Ross Steele Fellowship, and I'm delighted to introduce Johanna Ellersdorfer, who was our Ross Steele Fellow back in 2022. Johanna is a paintings conservator who has worked on collections here in Australia as well as across Europe and the United States. She's currently doing her PhD at the University of Sydney, but today it is all about her fellowship, and she's going to be talking about celebrated colonial artist Maurice Felton. So if you have any questions for Johanna, you all know the drill, you're all trained professionals by now. Just pop those questions in the chat feature in Zoom and I'll come back and I'll ask those questions at the end of Johanna's talk. So I'll see you soon. Thanks, Johanna.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Okay. So hi, I'm Johanna. I'd also say thank you, Rachel, for that introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people as the traditional owners of the unceded lands where I live and work, and where I'm also speaking from today. And I extend that respect to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people who are listening in today. So I was the 2022 Ross Steele Fellow at the library, where I spent the year researching a collection of paintings by the colonial artist Maurice Felton. Both personally and professionally as a painting conservator, I have a long-standing interest in materiality and the ways that things are made. And over the year, I developed a stronger sense of not only how Felton was painting, but how his paintings as physical things in the world changed over time. This underlying interest guided my approach through the fellowship project, and that's where the focus of this talk will be today. Maurice Felton was perhaps one of the most skilled colonial artists working in what was then known as the colony of New South Wales. Despite this, he's relatively unknown to general audiences. Although he only had a brief career, Felton produced a large body of paintings, many of which are now in the collection of the State Library of New South Wales, which made him a really ideal candidate for a project like this. Through the fellowship, I closely examined his paintings. I also accessed collection and archival material, including an excellent Felton family biography by Mark Travis and family files associated with some of Felton's sitters. The diaries, I also looked at the diaries of one of Felton's known associates, Alexander Brodie Sparks, as well as some other files relating to artists who were working at the same time as Felton, including Conrad Martins. Additionally, I was able to access conservation files, which gave me invaluable information regarding materials and past restorations on some of the works. So before I go into the specifics of the research I carried out, I'd like to just give an overview of the kind of research that I was doing. So research that places materiality of paintings at the fore is often referred to as technical art history. Broadly defined as the technical examination of artworks, it's an approach that grew out of work undertaken in conservation studios and laboratories in the latter half of the 20th century. It aimed to better understand an object, usually a work of art, from both a physical and chemical perspective by drawing on art historical, archival, and scientific research. Art historian and paintings conservator Irma Herman sums it up well when she writes that technical art history aims at a thorough understanding of the physical object in terms of original intention, choice of materials and techniques, as well as the context in and for which the work was created. Its meaning and its contemporary perception also play a part. She goes on to say that at its best, technical art history is both an acknowledgement and celebration of the artist at work and the act of making. Extending beyond this, I believe that technical art history can also illuminate how painting has moved through the world once leaving the artist's studio. Painting conservator David Bomford also acknowledged this when he writes that by examining paintings and interpreting physical evidence, we, conservators, are able to suggest narratives on the making of works of art by virtue of the understanding of materials and structure that our practical experience gives us. The narrative continues with cumulative events in the subsequent history of the work, aging, deterioration, accident repair, intervention, adaptation, reinterpretation, positive and negative events, some valued, some regretted. This focus on materials can be seen as culminating in Michael Yonan's recent call for the art historical object to be understood in quite literal terms as a thing or matter, and his assertion that technical art history can play the role of bringing that thingness into greater prominence. He advocates for understanding an object's materiality as operating in different ways at different moments in time, and also writes about objects as composite structures with internal as well as external histories. However, despite all of this, as art historian and conservator Emma Janssen laments, too often a conservator's contributions limited to either an appendix or technical entry at the back of a publication, or otherwise remain inaccessible in the form of an unpublished conservation report. I'm obviously biased in my interest in materials and techniques. However, I can't help but agree that much interesting and valuable information gleaned through processes of technical examination remains inaccessible, as Janssen writes, once the research is done. So my project aimed to understand Felton's paintings as composite structures with internal as well as external histories, to borrow Yonan's terms, and I aimed to understand them as objects that were made by Felton from materials sourced from broader networks that have, over the course of the past 180 years, been modified, restored, and recontextualized. Through this talk, I'll hopefully put the thingness of these paintings in focus. Having said that, I'd first like to properly introduce you to Maurice Felton. So Maurice Appleby Felton was born on the 15th of February, 1803 in Hinckley, Leicestershire, to parents John Felton and Elizabeth Appleby. According to Travis, his father was involved in the construction and maintenance of machines used in the hosiery trade, and his mother came from a family of nonconformist bakers and publicans. As far as we know, Felton did not formally train as an artist. Rather, he trained as a surgeon in Glasgow, completing his studies in 1830 at the Andersonian University, where he was awarded a prize for the best essay on the structure and formation of bone, as well as the Surgeon's Prize given by the Royal Infirmary for the best essay on internal inflammations succeeding severe injuries and surgical operations. A year later, in May 1831, he married Emily, also known as Amelia Felton, at St Mary's in Hinckley, and by July 1832, he appears to have been living in the Liverpool area, where he worked as a surgeon. From this period, we have possibly the only piece of extended writing by Felton himself, which is in the form of a letter to the editor that was published in a newspaper providing advice on public health measures to mitigate the cholera epidemic. From 1834, he and his wife welcomed 4 children, Louisa, Myra, Maurice, and Elisara. In March 1838, Felton is mentioned in a newspaper article saying that he had proposed instituting a picture gallery in Liverpool. However, this idea seems to have been quickly shut down by council members due to the cost. A year later, on the 27th of September 1839, Felton arrived in Sydney with his wife and 4 children, as well as his sister, aboard the Royal Admiral. The family settled in a house on the corner of Hunter Street near the intersection with Phillip Street, where a bridge crossed the Tank Stream. The grounds of the residence extended through to Elizabeth Street and contained commodious stables and coach houses and an attractive garden planted with some fine old willows and lemon trees. Felton's studio was located in the Hunter Street residence, and there are various references between 1840 and 1841 of people visiting his studio either to sit for portraits or to view his paintings. In January 1840, Felton had his first exhibition of portraits in Sydney at Mies's Lamb & Co. on George Street. The portraits were positively received, with one reviewer writing that for faithfulness of likeness and brilliancy of execution, they rival the productions of many of our best artists at home. Throughout 1840 and 1841, Felton also appears to have spent a reasonable amount of time visiting the shipping merchant Alexander Brodie Spark at his home in Tempe in the south of Sydney, becoming acquainted with other members of Sydney society, as well as the artists Eliade and Prout. In October of 1840, he travelled through the Illawarra region with Brodie Spark, as well as a Mr. Innes and a Mr. Hancock, visiting the Kangaroo River, Kiama, Jamberoo and Balgony, amongst other places. He painted landscapes of at least some of these places, including Tom Thumb's Lagoon, which is in the State Library collection and is pictured here. In May 1841, he attended the Queen's birthday celebration in Sydney, and in September 1841 exhibited another collection of portraits at his Hunter Street residence, including a portrait of Queen Victoria that was particularly well received. However, he wasn't without his critics. One wrote somewhat backhandedly that Felton is an exceedingly modest, well-informed and well-educated gentleman who has, from an amateur, become a professed artist. He is uncommonly happy in some of the likenesses of his oil portraits, which are well painted and cannot fail to please all who have seen them, even though some of the female portraits exhibit the very vulgar taste and profuse and overdone ornament in costume. He then goes on to say that Felton, then, is a good portrait painter, good and very good, at least for Sydney. In November 1841, Felton announced an art union lottery of his paintings. It seems Felton was one of the first in Australia to sell his works in this way, despite art unions having been active in Europe since the 18th century. In the lead up to this, he exhibited a number of works at his residence in Hunter Street, and on the 14th of January 1842, held a raffle to dispose of the works. This apparently signalled the tentative beginnings of an art union system in Sydney, similar to the art unions of Edinburgh, which were well known and admired by settlers in the colony. However, despite positive reviews of his work, the lottery was not considered a success, and no more art unions took place in Sydney until 1847. Only months later, on the 30th of March, Felton died at his Hunter Street residence of what was described in an obituary in the Leicester Herald as a long and painful illness. In an entry in Brodie Spark's diary, he writes of receiving a letter from Felton's wife 2 days before his death, informing him that his friend's days were numbered. Felton's various obituaries in Australian papers speak of his character and his talents highly. After his death, some of Felton's works were included in 3 notable exhibitions. In 1847, his portrait of Queen Victoria and also a copy of the painting Member of the Humane Society by Landseer, which depicts a large Newfoundland dog, were exhibited in the Society for the Promotion of the Fine Arts in Australia. The whereabouts of the latter painting is currently unknown. Reviews from this exhibition were positive, with one writing that both paintings were fair specimens of the artist's agreeable manner. Although another considered the head of the dog well painted, but the hair of the body too woolly. In 1849, his fancy portrait, a self-portrait in costume, which is the painting pictured in the middle, was included in the second exhibition for the Society for the Promotion of Fine Arts, where it was considered evidently the production of no mean artist. It was also listed as the property of Mrs. Felton, which means that between the art union lottery, in which it was won by a Mr. M.A. McGarr, it must have been passed back to Felton's wife. The third mention of his works being exhibited were in 1897, where his portrait of Conrad Martens was included in an exhibition of Conrad Martens' work, where it was noted that the painting was the property of Myra Felton, his daughter. So the State Library has 14 paintings attributed to Felton listed in the catalogue, including 10 portraits and 3 landscapes, as well as a small sketch. Other known works by Felton include 1 portrait at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, 1 at the National Gallery of Australia, and 3 at the National Portrait Gallery. Through archival research, I was also able to put together a list of paintings and drawings made by Felton either during his time in Sydney or brought with him from England. Although I don't believe this list to be exhaustive, it does suggest that he produced at least 50 works. Although Felton is primarily known as a portrait painter, this list also suggests that he was quite a versatile artist, painting numerous landscapes, still lifes, and copies. I was able to look at all of Felton's paintings in the State Library of New South Wales collection, as well as a couple of other unattributed portraits from the same period. Before I go into more detail, I want to outline what a painting is from a materials perspective. So a painting is a composite structure made of many materials that age and interact with each other and external forces in different ways. This diagram is useful for understanding the general structure most paintings will take. The lowest layer is the support, which is usually a canvas stretched over a wooden stretcher or strainer, or a panel made from wood, metal, or really whatever material an artist chooses to paint on. On top of the support, we might have a size layer, traditionally something like a rabbit skin glue, which is applied to make the support less absorbent. On top of this layer, there is usually a ground layer, which is a uniform layer of color that is applied to create an even surface and can also impact how the subsequent paint layers appear. On top of the ground layer, there will be a series of paint layers, and then finally, there will be a varnish layer. Most technical studies of paintings begin with simple techniques. Taking the time to closely look at what is there is often the best way to determine whether further examination techniques are likely to yield useful information or not. Most of my approach included looking closely at the paintings under different light conditions, including raking light, in which a light is held to the side of a painting to reveal information about texture, and ultraviolet light, which can be used to identify varnish layers, old restorations, and in some instances, pigments. I was able to examine some paintings under a stereo microscope down in the conservation studios, which was also useful for examining the supports in more detail, as well as his application of paint. In addition to this, I looked at some paint cross sections, which gave a sense of the layer structure of the paintings. And Helen Casey from the conservation team here at the library was also able to take some readings using X-ray fluorescence or XRF for me. We did this to identify some pigments and also a metal painting support, which is something I'll discuss in a little more detail later on. Usually when we discuss paintings in conservation, we move from the bottom layer upwards, emulating the way an artist would paint, and this is how I'll approach Felton's paintings today. However, rather than focusing on a single painting, I would like to talk about Felton's paintings collectively, drawing on individual paintings to highlight different aspects of how his works were made, cared for, and how they have moved through the world. It's also important to say that these observations are necessarily made from the relatively small group of his paintings that are known and in collections. So Felton seems to have painted mostly on linen canvas supports. Most of the canvases I looked at have a fine plain weave, which is one thread over, one thread under. It's a very simple weave structure. And many have a similar thread count, which was about 18 to 20 threads per centimetre. Like most canvas supports, they are stretched on strainers, which are wooden frames, or stretchers, which are wooden frames with keys so that the bars can be adjusted to compensate for a slackening of tension over time. Canvas is also usually attached to stretchers with metal tacks, and it's clear that many of Felton's paintings have been re-stretched numerous times. Some of his paintings have also been lined, meaning that the original canvas has been adhered to a secondary, more stable fabric support, or in some instances, a board. This is often a treatment carried out when a canvas has been damaged in some way, such as through large tears, although it is a treatment that is avoided where possible today. On the back of his portrait of Queen Victoria, there is a canvas stamp from the British colourman Robeson and Miller. And you can see this on the image to the left of this slide. So Robeson and Miller were one of the largest colourman suppliers in England, operating between 1828 and 1840. The Robeson of Robeson and Miller was Charles Robeson, who in 1819 opened his first shop in London close to the Royal Academy schools. And in 1828, his assistant Thomas Miller became a partner, and they operated under the name Robeson and Miller until 1840 when the partnership dissolved. They stocked a range of standard canvases, and the measurements of these can be found in catalogues of the time. Almost all of Felton's portraits on canvas more or less align with the measurements of standard Kit Kat 3/4 and Bishop half-length sizes, which were specifically designed to allow for different amounts of the sitter's body to be depicted. Felton's portrait of Queen Victoria, for instance, was a Kit Kat size designed specifically so the artist could include the hands of the sitter. I'll also just draw your attention if you want to take a look at this image to the left. So when I refer to the canvas stamp, it's quite difficult to see, but it's basically like these letters in here, which spell out the name Robeson and Miller and also give their address. And also this CR number is quite typical of Robeson and also Robeson and Miller canvas stamps. So standard size canvases were not at all uncommon during the 19th century. Robeson and Miller, like other colourmen, offered a range of standard sizes marketed for portrait painting that could be made up in 3 different cloth types. This was most likely done out of convenience. So convenience for the artist, convenience for the artist, colourman or supplier who stocked the supplies, and also convenience for the frame maker. Efficiency was also likely a motivating factor here, particularly in the context of British portrait painting, which had an emphasis on producing a product at a relatively affordable price. During Felton's time in Sydney, Robeson and Miller had a presence in the Australian colonies. According to research carried out by painting conservators Paula Dredge and Erica Burgess in the late 18th, Paula Dredge and Erica Burgess, by the late 1830s, Robeson and Miller appear to have been the colourman of choice for those Australian professional artists wishing to order a large stock of painting materials from England. Artists ordering for the first time from Robeson and Miller used Sydney shipping agents to handle the transactions. However, they also note that artists based in the colonies who travelled back to England for a visit saw the necessity of stocking up on artist supplies in England before returning. It is possible that Felton was ordering from Australia until the dissolving of Robeson and Miller's partnership in 1840. However, based on the timeline, I believe it's more likely that he purchased canvases in England prior to emigrating. In Conrad Martin's Commonplace book, I did actually find a list of materials to be purchased by Alexander Brady Spark. So based on what we know of their connection, it is possible that he was also purchasing material for Felton. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any record of purchase that named Felton, but hopefully more answers will emerge with time. Within the group of paintings I examined, there were 3 notable works not painted on standard size canvases. Fancy Self-Portrait, which is a self-portrait of the artist, was painted on a wooden panel. And this panel appears to have been extended, which is something I will speak about in more detail later, but you can see the back of it in this slide. A portrait of Conrad Martin's was also painted on Academy board, which is a thin, semi-rigid support made from pre-primed pulp board. This was also purchased from Robeson and Miller, as indicated by the presence of the colourman's label. And this label is quite similar to the stamp that was on the back of the canvas of Queen Victoria. And the last of these is Garden Island from the Domain, and this was painted on a metal panel. So metal supports, particularly copper, are not entirely uncommon in the history of painting. Although previously listed as copper, we did XRF analysis and it indicated a high iron content with a small amount of tin on this painting. And this doesn't really correlate with a standard metal support used in painting, which makes me think that it was probably a found material used out of practicality more than anything else. In considering these 3 anomalies alongside Felton's other paintings, what stands out is that these paintings were not portrait commissions of members of Sydney society. This indicates to me that Felton was probably saving his canvas supports for commercial work and using whatever other supports he had at hand for works that he perhaps didn't initially paint with the explicit intention of selling. So moving up through the painting, we come now to the ground layers. Ground layers are a uniform layer of colour, often white or off-white, that is applied to create an even surface and can also impact how the subsequent paint layers appear. According to a popular 19th century artist manual, The Materials of the Artist and Their Use in Painting by Max Derner, ground layers make the surface tighter, less absorbent, and more luminous, and so enable the artist to better realise his objective and give durability to his work. All of Felton's paintings that I examined had white or off-white ground layers, which I was mostly able to glimpse at the edge of paintings, or in some instances on the tacking margins, which are the parts of the canvas support that are folded around the strainer or stretcher. In this slide here, the ground layer that I'm referring to is if you look at the very edge of the painting and you can see a little area of white. So that's the amount of material that you're often looking at when you're looking at ground layers. In my initial examinations with UV light, I did notice that some of the exposed ground layers on tacking margins of his portrait paintings fluoresced a pinkish colour, which can be indicative of lead white pigment, and we were able to confirm the presence of a lead white ground in some of his paintings with XRF. So when examining Fancy Portrait, the appearance of two different ground layers provided some indication that part of the painting had been extended after it had originally been painted. So this painting is quite small and features a head-size portrait of Felton wearing a hat with a large feather attached to it. Along the right side of the painting, an extension measuring about 5 centimetres has been attached. And you can see this quite clearly on the verso image, but once you see it on the verso or the image of the back of the panel, it's also quite obvious on the front. So there's like a very fine line sort of running down the edge of his hat that you might be able to see. Okay. So the wood of the panel and the extension do appear different, which is quite obvious from the back. And the beveling on the original appears to have been evened out along the extended edge to facilitate the join. On the front side of the painting, the extension appears to have been painted with a much less fluid painting technique, although it does blend in pretty well if you're not aware of it being there. Without any records, it is impossible to say why this was done. It's possible that it was extended by someone who felt that it improved the composition, and I did speculate that perhaps his daughter Myra, who was also an artist and came to own the painting, had adjusted it, as other children of Australian artists have been known to improve their parents' work in an attempt to make it more marketable. However, this theory was disproved by XRF analysis. Looking at the ground layer of the original and the extension, we found the original contained lead, which was in keeping with other observations of his paintings, while the extension contained titanium, indicating the presence of titanium white, a pigment that was not marketed to artists until 1921, some 80 years after Felton's death, and also a year after the death of his daughter Myra. So Felton painted with oils, which is to be expected of this period. Oil paints are mixtures of pigments and a drying oil, such as linseed oil, and started to be widely used in easel painting from the 15th century. Felton appears to have used a reasonably limited palette, with lots of browns, reds, blacks, white, and a blue pigment. Based on historical availability and appearance, it seems likely he was using pigments such as lamp black, various umbers, possibly a Van Dyke brown, and the blue on some of the paintings looks as though it could be smalt. However, further analysis would be required to definitively identify these. With XRF, we did identify the presence of vermilion on one painting, which is a bright red pigment, as well as lead white on a number of paintings. No analysis was done to identify the drying oils, as this is quite difficult. However, based on the way the paint has aged, it seems Felton was painting with medium-rich paints. This means he was mixing a high proportion of either drying oil or varnish into his paint mixtures, which has given them a very glossy and transparent appearance. This admixture has also resulted in the formation of drying cracks through darker colours in many of his paintings. Felton's application of paint is very economical. His technique is mostly smooth and naturalistic, and he tends to work in thin layers over the ground. There are very few visible brush strokes, except on smaller details and his sitters' faces, and I think this is illustrated quite well in this portrait of Conrad Martens in Raking Light, where you can see the detail on his face, quite clearly. In his flesh tones, in particular, there is also a strong red undertone. In some instances, it seems as though the red layer has been applied below the flesh tones, where in other instances, the two layers appear mixed. I did initially wonder if Felton was using red underpaintings, which was not an uncommon technique in the 19th century, and it seems that maybe in some paintings he was, while in others he simply mixed the red into the flesh tones to create a similar appearance. There are also areas of impasto that seem to have been intentionally placed to emphasize small details such as jewels, fabrics, designs, or light hitting the features of sitters' faces that he used quite regularly across all of his portraits. And these are some examples of that in his lovely portrait of Mrs. Anna Elizabeth Walker. In Felton's portrait of Lieutenant J.J. Peters, we can also see something of Felton's painting process through the appearance of pentimenti. Pentimenti are basically forms under the surface of the paint layer that have been painted over, but over time they begin to be visible again. In this instance, we can see that Felton painted the buttons of the sitter's jacket, but moved them a little over to the left during the painting process. So as the paint has aged, the appearance of these first buttons has become increasingly visible. If you look closely at the detail image here, you can see that there are pentimenti to the right of the top two buttons. So they're two small circles right here. And this allows us to see something of his process in working through issues of perspective and composition. Another insight we gain into Felton's painting process is from the view of a sitter. So in Alexander Brodie Sparks' diary, he writes about commissioning a portrait of his wife, Maria, and also he reflects also on sitting himself for a portrait. So on commissioning his wife's portrait, he writes, "Desirous of having my bonny bride's likeness, I engaged Mr. Felton to do his best. He remained all day at Tempe and made a sketch of the desired attitude." These initial sketches were followed up by 2 additional sittings in which Felton presumably completed the painting. On the 5th of June, Brodie Spark writes, "Drove Maria to Mr. Felton's and saw the portrait in an imperfect state." And then on the 20th of June, he writes, "Visited Mr. Felton to criticise the painting." On the 19th of August, the final mention of the painting at Tempe reads, "Mr. Felton, after retouching the painting, returned in the afternoon to town." This indicates an almost collaborative process between artist and sitter, at least in this instance, with Felton adjusting his painting to suit the requirements and tastes of Maria. Brodie Sparks' reflections on his own experience sitting are much less detailed, which is very much in line with his writing style throughout his diary. Starting off with an entry on the 12th of September 1840, in which he writes, "Sat for my portrait to Mr. Felton for the first time, 2 hours, followed by 5 other mentions of sitting for 1 hour over the course of the month of September." Another approach to painting can be gleaned from writings about Felton's portrait of Queen Victoria. As one of his most celebrated paintings, it depicts the Queen in her parliamentary robes looking back over her shoulder, and it's actually a copy of an 1838 painting by the American artist Thomas Sully. According to an article in the Sydney Herald, Mr. Felton had the opportunity of examining the original picture several times, and by the assistance of a print and his remembrance of the colouring of the original, he has been enabled to produce the really beautiful picture in question. It's also written that he painted the Landseer copy of the Newfoundland dog from an etching. Felton appears to have begun work on the portrait of Queen Victoria in July 1840. In a diary entry from the 31st of July, Brodie Spark writes that he visited Felton and saw his Queen, with a second visit to see his progress on the painting noted on the 10th of August. By September 1840, the painting appears to have been complete and was reported in the Sydney Herald that Mr. Felton had no objection to submit his picture for a few afternoons to public view. Interestingly, both the portrait of Maria and of Queen Victoria were completed in about 3 months. So we're reaching now the final layer of Felton's paintings, and these are the varnish layers. The top layer of most traditional paintings is a varnish layer, and Felton's works are no exception to this. Varnishes are usually applied to even out the surface of a painting, creating cohesion through the application of a thin, transparent layer of gloss. The presence of a varnish can drastically alter the way a painting appears, providing the colours with increased saturation and depth, and in a way could be understood as a kind of filter through which the rest of the painting is seen. Varnishes have also been understood to act as a protective layer over the paint film that will age sacrificially, and as a result of this, they do tend to yellow over time, sometimes drastically altering the appearance of a painting. For this reason, up until the late 19th century, it was expected that paintings would undergo cycles of being varnished, cleaned, and revarnished. These treatments are still often carried out by conservators today, although with a lot more discretion than our 19th century counterparts. All of Felton's paintings that I examined were varnished. However, as to be expected with paintings of this age, all of the varnishes were restorer or conservator applied. In some of the conservation reports, a previous conservator noted that during his work on the paintings, he left traces of what he believed to be an original discoloured varnish that was a natural resin intact on the surface. These were barely perceptible to the naked eye, but were visible in UV light. In UV light, they fluoresced in such a way as to indicate they were natural resin, which basically confirmed the conservator's observations, which again is typical of 19th century painting practices. It is likely Felton was using mastic or damar, and it's also possible that he was mixing drying oils in with his varnishes. However, the varnishes currently on the paintings emulate, as contemporary applied varnishes should, the gloss level that would have been desired by artists of the period and allow us to see Felton's work without a film of discoloration obscuring his intended compositions. The last aspect of Felton's paintings that I feel warrants some attention is his signature. You may have noticed in some of the previous slides that he often signed his works on the back in large painted script, always referring to himself as Maurice Felton, surgeon. We can only speculate as to his motivations for this, and indeed the motivations of others who also identified him this way. However, it was clear that by the end of his short time in Sydney, he was not just considered a surgeon, but very much admired as an artist. So with that in mind, I'd like to end with part of one of Felton's obituaries published in The Australian on the 31st of March, 1842, in which the writer declared, "The talents of this gentleman as an artist were of a high order, and the admiration which his painting so justly commanded tended much to encourage the love and cultivation of his elegant art amongst the inhabitants of Sydney." So I'd like to thank the library's collection care branch of the Ainslie Conservation Lab, especially manager Jonathan London, for giving me access to the studios that I could look at the paintings. Senior exhibitions conservator Helen Casey and her team Kath Bartley and Jochen Lech for assistance accessing the paintings, and paper conservator Dana Kubka for her assistance with the microscopes. I'm also especially grateful to Helen Casey for carrying out the XRF analysis, as well as for her insights and thoughtful contributions throughout the project. And of course, I'd also like to extend a very warm thank you to Rachel Franks and Richard Neville. I feel so fortunate to have been able to carry out this research with the support of the fellowship, and I hope that I've been able to make a small contribution to a much understudied artist. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was absolutely terrific. And I'm sure Richard is delighted that you spent so much time talking about the fancy portrait, which is in fact one of his favourite paintings up in the galleries here at the library. So people are starting to ask questions. If you have a question you're watching, do pop that into the chat and we'll try and answer as many as we can in the time that we have left. So we have a really interesting mix in our audience today. We have some professional conservators, we have historians. Lots of your colleagues from the Fellows Program are here with us this morning, and we also have people who are very interested in what our Fellows are doing. So we have a little bit of a mix in the types of questions, which I think is a really terrific thing and sort of reiterates that these conversations at the library are for everyone. So the first one is all about you and what surprised you the most. So looking at these paintings with your technical expertise, also with your natural curiosity and your appreciation for these artworks, what was the discovery that you thought, oh, wow, either that's really exciting or something that perhaps took you a little bit by surprise?
I think so there were probably any number of things that I could say that surprised me. The thing that I think was probably the biggest surprise was realizing that the fancy portrait was extended, because I'd looked at it in the gallery spaces and had never noticed it before. And then once you see it out of the frame, it's so obvious. So that was hugely surprising, even though I feel like it shouldn't have been such a surprise in hindsight. Yeah.
It's quite obvious, even just when you drew attention to it on the slide. So I didn't know that there was that extra there. And suddenly all I could see was the line in the front.
Yeah, as soon as you see it, you can't not see it. Yeah.
So do you think that it was easier to add a bit to include all of the hat, that maybe the hat had been truncated at some point? And
maybe I honestly don't know. I really sort of like stuck. I wanted it to be like an extension that was put on by Myra, I think, for a certain part of it, but it definitely wasn't. But yeah, I really can't say. Like on some level, maybe it was extended by a restorer or someone else because they thought it improved the composition. But then also you've got to remember, like, paintings do have a life. And so perhaps it was always initially, like, originally meant to be that large. And for some reason that part of the, that part of the panel had been particularly damaged. And that was the way that a particular restorer decided to deal with that issue. Yeah, I don't feel like, yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's more that it has just been extended, but yeah, I honestly can't say with, 100% certainty. Yeah.
So that's a question that's coming through now, which might be a little bit outside the remit of what you've
Yeah.
for today, but there is some surprise in the audience. I mean, obviously, we look at
Yeah.
Felton now with potentially more reverence than the
Mm.
one who said very good, at least for Sydney.
Yeah.
But it does seem quite a bold move to
Mm.
just say, oh, I'm going to make that hat bigger and add a bit
Yeah.
and paint itself. Is that
Yeah.
something that was common for the period, that people would just say, oh, I'll have a bit more house, thanks?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was common, but like there is definitely a history like throughout conservation up until, yeah, I guess really sort of like relatively recently. So I guess more like the 20th century where people stopped doing this, where a lot of liberty was taken, I suppose, with people who own the paintings or who were restoring the paintings. And so, I mean, in a lot of European paintings, for instance, you'll have features painted out or painted in. One painting that's coming to mind that I worked on, well, this is a few years ago now, when I was living overseas. There was a painting that had two angels painted into it for no reason other than at some point in the history of that painting, whoever had owned it decided that they wanted to have an angel in the sky. And so that sort of thing is not hugely uncommon, but yeah, it's not, it is always, yeah, like you do kind of wonder what people were thinking. Yeah.
Something that certainly we wouldn't do.
Yeah. Oh, no, 100%. You would not do that now. You would absolutely not do that now. Yeah, I think conservation is a lot more guided by ethics these days than it maybe used to be.
Personal taste of a
Yeah.
current owner.
Yeah.
Somebody's extending that question a little bit.
Yeah.
And the frames
Yeah.
that pictures are in,
Mm.
and you can tell any stories perhaps about the frames, and are they original and have they been reframed, and how
Yeah.
synthetic they might be.
So I didn't actually do a huge amount of work on the frames. Helen Casey actually has done quite a lot of research on the frames. But what I do know is that sort of as thanks to in part to her research, there has been a couple of the works have been reframed in frames, I believe in the style of Solomon Lewis, who was a frame maker at the time working in Sydney and was known to have connections with Felton. So the portrait of Maria, which is at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, there is a mention in Alexander Brady Sparks' diary about visiting Solomon Lewis about the frame. Can't remember exactly what it says. But yeah, that's probably all I can really say on the frames. Yeah, sorry.
So, I mean, I know it's sort of, we can't have everything here
Yeah.
at Melbourne, but sometimes you sort of feel a little bit sad that there are other things in other places.
Yeah.
It would be nice to have them here, but anyway, I can't
Yeah.
get into trouble
I mean,
for
it's a
that.
beautiful painting, the Maria portrait. Yeah.
Somebody's asking you to sort of be an art critic for a
Oh.
little bit rather than a conservator or historian. Do you have a favourite painting because you believe not just that you like it,
Mm.
but there's a specific talent that's on full display of Felton?
Yeah, so the fancy portrait I think is probably his strongest one. I think it is beautifully painted. Um, so I would say that one. But then I also, this is maybe not from a critic's point of view, but for some reason I really love the view from Garden Island. I don't think it's necessarily one of his strongest works, but there's just something about it that I really, really like. So yeah.
And somebody else is asking now that,
Mm.
and it's always interesting as we sort of look back and reflect on these works, whether they're paintings or books, all sorts of things. But what were his contemporaries looking for? And I mean, you read out some really interesting public reviews of his work as part of your talk today, but the people that he was painting for, obviously Maria had a couple of opinions.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit more.
Um, Gosh, yeah, I'm not quite sure what to say on that. I think like there was a desire, to have, Australian painters emulating obviously like the work that was being carried out overseas, particularly the UK. But I think there was this strong sense that whatever was happening here wasn't nearly as good as what was happening, back in England, or in Europe more generally. Um, yeah, you sort of see like a lot of artists that were working at a similar time sort of weren't necessarily trained artists. I think Conrad Martins was like maybe an exception to that. But other artists like I think Joseph Backler, for instance, were convicts who came out and then sort of, changed paths. Or like Felton, who it seems like, he trained as a surgeon, was working as a surgeon, but then maybe took the opportunity of coming here to like, I don't know, really delve into like, his interest in painting and, really push that quite far. But yeah.
Somebody's now asking about this is kind of a workload question.
Yeah.
So I should point out to everybody who's listening in,
Mm.
Johanna's actually one of the very few PhD candidates that has been accepted for a position here at the library because we don't fund people to complete a course of study. So we're very conscious that they're doing a PhD or they're doing something, and then they need to do something for us because we're very vain here at the library. It's all about us. So you've been juggling both.
Yeah.
And somebody is asking, will there be more? So will you be doing a journal article or a book chapter or something else
Yeah.
that specifically captures the work you've done as part of your fellowship?
I hope so. I would really like to publish this somewhere. I've sort of had to put it all a little bit on the back burner at the moment because I'm in the final stages of my PhD. So that is sort of taking most of my brain space at the moment. But yeah, definitely like maybe 6 months from now, I would like to try and put this together into something that I can submit to a journal, because I do think it's interesting. And, there isn't a huge amount written on artists from this period in Sydney. So I hope, yeah, I think it is. There are some contributions there that I would like to get out there. Yeah.
You did do a couple of entries for the library's
Oh,
book Reading the
yeah,
Rooms.
of course. Yeah. Yeah.
Exciting. So we do have
Yeah.
some of Johanna's work published and in print and available now for people who
Yeah.
can't wait. But there will be more to come, which is very
Yeah.
exciting. And so someone is now asking probably quite an obvious question. Are you able to tell us a little bit about your PhD, even though it's possibly the last thing as you're running towards the finish line that you want to talk about? But if you can give us
Yeah.
a bit of an insight into that research that you're doing.
Yeah, so my PhD research is quite different in a lot of ways from this. So I'm in the creative writing department at Sydney Uni, and I'm writing about materiality, basically. So I'm just looking at different ways of writing about material culture. So I draw a lot actually on my training as a conservator and the way that I approach looking at things, but I take a much more, I guess, experimental and creative approach in the way that I'm doing that work compared to the work that I did for the fellowship. Um, and I guess the other big difference between what I did for this and what I'm doing for my PhD is that I'm not really looking at paintings in my PhD. I think I might look at one, but most of the objects that I'm looking at are like I look at sort of like miniatures and nature prints and a lake. So I'm taking like quite a broad view of object, for that work. Yeah.
And someone's coming back to Felton and that idea of his reception. And with those kind obituaries that you shared highlights from, but someone's saying you just mentioned Joseph Backler.
Mm.
Do you think that there was an appreciation in colonial Sydney
Mm.
of how good Felton was in comparison to his peers?
Yeah, I do. I do think there was. I can't think of anything specific to like to draw on at this point, but I definitely feel as though the way that he was written about compared to other people did put him on another level. Yeah, yeah, I do think his skill was particularly admired. Yeah.
That's comforting. So many people have to wait. So they have to be
Yeah.
dead
Yeah,
such
true.
a long time.
Yeah.
People appreciate them.
Mm,
Someone is now on the hunt for the missing painting
oh,
that you mentioned at the outset. We can only hope that by highlighting
yeah,
collections here at the library, people go and sift through stuff that they might have in a shed or have a keener eye when they're,
yeah.
trawling through secondhand shops. Do you think some of these things do turn up? Have you seen in your experience as a
Mm.
conservator little discoveries that make some of the hunts worthwhile?
Yeah, I mean, things do turn up, and I really do feel like there's got to be some of these paintings out there. And I think also, given the way that he signed a lot of his paintings, like they should be pretty easy to find, like if you know what you're looking for, or if you happen to stumble across them, I suppose. But yeah, like things can turn up. I guess it's a lot, often it's just to do with luck, but also hopefully something like this. So like, shedding some light on him as a painter, gets people thinking about him and aware of his work. And maybe, they'll go and look at a painting that they've seen or have around, like, even private collectors who just haven't thought much about it. Yeah, and realize that actually like it is signed by Felton. So yeah, things could show up, and I really hope they do.
Of
Yeah.
course. So, what was the gateway painting for you? What was the painting of Felton's that made you stop and say, I really need to know more about this man and his work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, so I think as conservators, there's a couple of different ways that people sort of approach the research side of things. And some people are very like focused on a particular period of time or a particular artist. For me, I think it's more to do with like the process. So I don't have like a particularly strong interest in one period over another. I find just any process of making quite fascinating. And so I think realizing that there were a number of portraits by him and that they were also good, like they were all really good quality, was sort of like the gateway. So it wasn't necessarily a single painting, it was more looking at them collectively and saying, like, this could be interesting to look at these together. And given that there were so many at the State Library of New South Wales, it just seemed like a perfect opportunity and a really nicely contained project. Yeah.
Well, we're looking forward to what you do next. People
Yeah.
are sending you all sorts of good thoughts,
Oh, thank
especially
you.
our listeners today who have done a PhD and they know exactly what the last 6 months is all about. Even if it was a long time ago, I don't think anybody ever quite forgets
Yeah.
that dash to the finish line. But I know that you are in good hands at Sydney and you have most excellent supervisors.
Thank
So
you.
wish you well, just
Oh,
stay
thank
on task
you.
and you will be fine.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
to everybody who came along today, that is all we have time for. These scholar talks go so fast, um, but I hope that you will be able to join us next month. So next time we'll have one of our visiting scholars presenting. Professor Sharon Crozier de Rosa will be talking about librarian, trade unionist and women's rights activist Jean Arnott. And what a fascinating woman she is. She was feisty. We like her a lot. So you'll be able to learn more about her story and what she did for women in the workplace. That's next month in July the 2nd here at 11 a.m. Until then, we have lots of things on site here at the library. Please do have a look at our What's On. Check out highlights in Open Book and pop in if you can for some of our new exhibitions, which are just opened or opening very soon. Until I see you here at the library in real life or online, thank you all very much for participating in the conversation and stay safe. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.